The Second World War ended in 1945. Britain made its final war-related payments to the United States and Canada in 2006. But these were not simply old battlefield loans. They came from the post-war rescue Britain needed after Lend-Lease stopped and its dollars were running out. So the real question is why victory left Britain borrowing, and why the bill lasted 61 years. Start with the transfer itself. On Friday, the 29th of December 2006, the last working day of the year, the British government made its final scheduled payments to the United States and Canada. The American payment was about $83 million. Together, the two transfers came to just over £54 million at the exchange rate used in a British parliamentary review. The people processing that payment had not fought in the war. Many had not been born when the agreement was signed, yet they were closing an account created by the economic shock of 1945. That last phrase matters, because the account is usually described too simply. Britain did receive enormous American support during the war. Under Lend-Lease, the United States transferred roughly $50 billion of goods and services to its allies in the money of the time. Around $31 billion went to Britain. The Soviet Union received roughly $11 billion. But Lend-Lease was not an ordinary bank loan. Equipment used up destroyed or returned after the war was generally not treated like a house mortgage waiting to be repaid in full. What remained, what was still moving through the supply pipeline, and what could serve a civilian purpose had to be sorted out separately. Then Japan surrendered and the system stopped. For Britain, that was not the end of a convenient discount. It was the sudden removal of the supply mechanism on which the country had come to depend. Food, raw materials, fuel, machinery, and goods already moving across the Atlantic now had to be paid for with dollars Britain did not have. This is the first economic fact of victory. Britain won the war and emerged with a severe balance of payments crisis. It had sold foreign assets. It had drawn down gold and dollar reserves. It owed large sterling balances overseas. Its export industries had spent 6 years serving war production, while civilian machinery, transport, housing, and inventories had worn down. Soldiers still had to be brought home. The population still had to eat. Factories still needed imported material before they could produce exports. The shooting stopped. The demand for dollars did not. So Clement Attlee's government sent John Maynard Keynes to Washington. Keynes was not there to negotiate another campaign. He was there to negotiate Britain's passage from war to peace. The British hoped that their wartime sacrifice would be recognized with a grant or interest-free assistance. That was not what Washington offered. The main American agreement provided a line of credit of $3,750 million. Its stated purpose was post-war to finance purchases from the United States, cover transitional balance of payments deficits, protect gold and dollar reserves, and help Britain move toward a multilateral trading system. There was also a separate American facility of $586 million connected to the settlement of Lend-Lease, reciprocal aid, surplus property, and other wartime financial claims. Canada made its own agreement. It offered a credit of $1,250 million Canadian dollars. Britain eventually drew about $1,185 million of it. These were related products of the same crisis, but they were not one identical pile of wartime borrowing. That distinction is the key to understanding what Britain finally paid in 2006. The main credits carried 2% interest and were scheduled across 50 annual installments, beginning at the end of 1951. The agreements also contained relief provisions for years when Britain's foreign exchange position became too weak. Britain used those provisions 6 times. So the famous 61-year span does not mean that Britain signed one ordinary loan in 1945 and obediently posted the same check every year. It means a post-war financial package linked to the consequences of the war, survived through changing currencies, governments, recessions, and 6 authorized interruptions until the final scheduled payments were made. 2% sounds cheap, and by the standards of commercial borrowing it was, but a low rate carried across half a century is still a long political commitment. Every payment had to be earned in the currencies of the lenders. Britain could print pounds. It could not print dollars. And the price of the agreement was not limited to interest. The United States wanted a more open international trading system. Britain had spent the war operating a sterling area in which countries pooled dollars and used exchange controls. The financial agreement required movement towards sterling convertibility and away from discriminatory trade restrictions. This sounds like a technical clause because it was written like one. In practice, it changed who could demand Britain's scarce dollars. Sterling convertibility began in July 1947. Holders of eligible sterling balances could convert them for dollars. Demand surged. Britain's reserves drained at a rate the government could not sustain, and convertibility was suspended after roughly 6 weeks. That short crisis reveals more than the headline amount of the loan. The money helped Britain buy time, but the conditions attempted to change the system through which Britain managed its shortage. The rescue and the pressure arrived in the same document. This is why simply calculating interest misses the economics. A sovereign loan is never only a quantity of money. It is access, timing, currency, conditions, and bargaining power. Britain needed dollars immediately. The United States could wait. That imbalance shaped the agreement before anyone calculated the first installment. The old version of this story often makes another mistake. It takes all the assistance delivered under Lend-Lease, compares it with the smaller amounts later negotiated for payment, and calls the difference a discount. That is not how the program was designed. The United States was not expecting every bomb, meal, truck tire, or gallon of fuel consumed in combat to return as cash. Post-war negotiations focused on articles still useful for civilian purposes, goods still in the pipeline, and the settlement of outstanding claims. Delivered aid and collectible debt are different columns. That distinction becomes essential when we look at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union received roughly $11 billion of American Lend-Lease assistance. Trucks, locomotives, rails, aviation fuel, food, machinery, and communications equipment supported an economy fighting an industrial war across enormous distances. Negotiations over the remaining Soviet obligation lasted for decades. In 1972, the two governments agreed on a settlement of at least $722 million, with payments extending to 2001. The Soviet Union paid $48 million, but the rest of the schedule became tied to the American decision on most favored nation trade treatment and export credits. When those political conditions failed, the payments stopped. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited the obligation. A United States Senate report at the beginning of this century described roughly $600 million of Russian Soviet-era debt as Lend-Lease debt. In 2006, Russia prepaid its wider Soviet-era Paris Club obligations, closing that inherited chapter as part of a much larger debt settlement. Britain also completed its American and Canadian payments in 2006. The coincidence is striking, but the accounts were not twins. Britain's package included new post-war credit and separate wartime settlements. The Soviet account arose from its own Lend-Lease negotiation, trade conditions, defaulted schedule, state collapse, and eventual Paris Club prepayment. Putting the two beside each other is useful only if we preserve those differences. What the comparison really shows is that sovereign debt does not have one automatic ending. Britain accepted a long, low-interest schedule and used its relief clauses. The Soviet Union made a political settlement, stopped after the initial payments, and left Russia to resolve the inherited balance decades later. The outcome depended not just on what had been delivered, but on what each government could negotiate, what the lender was willing to write off, and what later political conditions did to the agreement. There is another column that prevents this from becoming a cartoon about American generosity on one side and European dependence on the other. Reverse Lend-Lease moved goods and services toward the United States. Britain and other Allied governments provided bases, barracks, transport, maintenance, fuel, food, and local services to American forces overseas. The wartime system moved resources in both directions, even though the post-war financial settlements were not symmetrical. And then the policy environment changed again. Beginning in 1948, the Marshall Plan sent roughly $13 billion to Western Europe. Most of that assistance was provided as grants rather than loans. Britain received more Marshall aid than any other participating country, but Marshall aid did not erase the agreements already signed. The American and Canadian credits remained. Britain had negotiated when its need was immediate and before the new European Recovery Program existed. This is the uncomfortable economics of timing. Borrowers usually negotiate when waiting is no longer an option. Lenders negotiate when it still is. So did the United States get rich from Britain's repayments? That is also too simple. 2% over 50 annual installments, with relief available in bad years, was not an aggressive commercial rate. The financial advantage that mattered more was structural. The United States ended the war with its continental industrial base largely intact, commanding enormous productive capacity, holding much of the world's monetary gold, and supplying goods that other countries urgently needed. The loan did not create that position. It recorded it. Britain's problem was the reverse. It had mobilized successfully for war, but now had to convert factories, rebuild exports, support a population under continued austerity, and pay for imports in a currency it could not issue. Bread makes the contrast visible. Britain did not ration bread during the war. It introduced bread rationing in July 1946 after victory, as the American agreement was entering into force. That does not mean an installment directly removed a loaf from a table. It means the period remembered as victory was also a period of acute external constraint. The country had defeated Germany before it had solved how to pay for peace. And this brings us back to the transfer in 2006. The wrong lesson is that Britain spent 61 years paying America back for every tank and tin of food used during the war. It did not. The better lesson is stranger. A wartime supply system ended. A victorious country discovered it could not finance the transition alone, and the solution combined settlement, credit, trade reform, and currency obligations that lasted into the age of online banking. The war ended on the battlefield in 1945. Its institutions did not end on the same day. They migrated into loan agreements, reserve accounts, trade rules, and annual payments. That is why the final transfer matters. Not because $83 million was the largest number in the story. It was not. It matters because it was the last visible movement in a chain that began when victory removed the system keeping Britain supplied. The clerk who processed it had never heard an air raid siren. The computer used to send it belonged to a world the negotiators could not have imagined, but the account still knew where it came from.